Attention, attention everyone. This is the hashtag CNF podcast, a conversation with readers, writers, authors, filmmakers, in the genre of creative nonfiction, episode number 27. I insist that you sit down. Hey, it's my podcast. I can do whatever I want. So, excuse me. So, episode 27, huh? We're getting up there. Almost hitting the big 3-0. But before we get there, this episode deals and speaks with none other than Paul Lisicky, author of the wonderful memoir, The Narrow Door, published by Grey Wolf Press. I think you should go out and buy it. And when you do, just buy another one. You'll probably get free shipping or something. And then give that book to a friend. It's a nice wide-ranging conversation, as they all are, about the craft of writing nonfiction. And this one's a good one, just like all the others. So thanks for listening. And if you get a chance, subscribe, share it with a friend, and give it a rating or subscribe to my email newsletter over at brendanomera.com. All of that helps keep this train going. And so that is about it. Enjoy this conversation with Paul Lisicky. Thank you.
My class and I go through the slush submissions and try to pick out work that is memorable, that shines, that seems exciting and fresh to us.
That's got to be enlightening in some way for your students, too, to see the whole spectrum of work that gets submitted to a literary journal, like the good and the bad, and that can certainly be. It's always good to be reading. You always want to read the best, but it also kind of helps to read it still needs work.
Yeah, Right. I mean, I think they learn a lot about openings and the importance of having a really crystal, singular, to put a piece aside if it's not present and fresh from sentence one. So that's at the very least, they're learning that. And they just get an intuitive sense of what their own work is. I don't like this term so much, up against when they're spitting it out.
Yeah. So it's what's kind of cool how I came to be familiarized with The Narrow Door and your work in that sense was I submitted some work to Proximity for their essay contest and the narrative journalism contest. And so I had Bronwyn on the show a few weeks ago, well, actually months ago now at this point. And then I saw you and I saw you've written this memoir. I'm like, oh, this is great. Let me find out, the publisher, which is Grey Wolf Press, and reached out and was able to read it, and then subsequently reach out to you. And so that was kind of neat to see that you're in some way affiliated with a lot of the people I know with Proximity, like Maggie and Tracy McNamara, who's I think since moved on from Proximity. But I wonder how did you come to know them and be affiliated with them in some capacity?
Well, I think I probably know Maggie. Maggie must have read The Narrow Door, and I heard from her, I think back in March about, and she asked me if I'd be interested in judging the contest. Yep. So, that's how it all started.
Cool. And so what has the sort of the publicity and the promotion of your book been like the last few months since it's come out?
It was an intense burst from about mid-January till I'd say mid-May, and I must have done 30 readings in that time. Wow. And the great part is that I got to travel to wonderful cities. I got to see many old friends. It was grueling, but I think the grueling part is was standing online in the, at the airports, and it's tough, and it's a challenge to be in front of people, all those nights, but it felt very energizing. It gave me lots of adrenaline. It quieted down. It's been much more reasonable since. I mean, I think 4 book festivals this fall, and some college readings, and what else? Yeah. It seems pretty sane. I mean, there's usually no more than 1 or 2 things a week. So, and I get to go to California in 2 weeks for 5 days to teach a workshop at Pam Houston's Writing by Writers conference, and we get to go to Miami next month for the book fair. So yeah, it's good stuff.
Nice. What do you like most about doing the readings and putting you and your work out there as a real sort of putting a public face to your work? Like, what do you like most about that? Well,
I think there's something about standing in front of a crowd and feeling and sort of disappearing into the work that is a pleasure to me. It's the place where I get to be a performer. My earliest work as an artist was as a musician, so there's something really familiar to me about standing in front of a crowd and not quite being myself, but being this receptor for sound, if that makes sense. And being attuned to the audience, being attuned to its reactions, and feeling that a kind of energy passed back and forth. So I like that. And Q&As are fun too. I mean, you have to be on your toes, and sometimes you're not exactly able to give the best answer on your feet. But I like the sense of alertness around all that. And yeah, it's good.
Yeah, the Q&As are always nice, in that it's great to be able to engage with like readers face to face like that, and give them that extra level of texture and meaning to the work, to help them interpret what they've read, or sometimes refute what they've interpreted, even though when you put out a piece of work like that, it in essence becomes theirs, and it's almost no longer yours. But it's sometimes it is nice to engage in that. People have shown a certain sense of interest, that you've engaged them on some level, that they actually want to inquire more about you and your work, which is kind of nice.
Right. That's really beautifully put. And I think that's where the real pleasure lies, just standing in the midst of all that exchange. And you're absolutely right. When you realize as you're reading the work aloud, and in many cases, readers already know the work, maybe sometimes even better than I know the work. And at that point, it's theirs. You're just, helping it along by,
So you said you were a musician at one point, or maybe you still practice. What instrument do you play, and what was that experience like? Sort of honing your artistic craft through music.
Right. I guess I still am a pianist and a guitarist. Mm-hmm. So I started picking out music on our family piano when I was about 5 years old. Our piano was in sort of the center of the house, and it was impossible to move through the house without sort of contending it. So I would sit at the bench and start picking out notes, and I took piano lessons fairly early on. I started writing music as a teenager, both choral music, and I wanted to be a singer-songwriter, and was quite serious about it. And I was positive that was going to be my life. And then at a certain point, when I was an undergraduate, late in my undergraduate years, I took a writing workshop, and something shifted. over time, not immediately, but I came to writing at a time when I think I was up against what I saw to be the limitations of the particular field of music I was writing in. And the world of writing seemed to offer many more kinds of possibilities. I could combine in a piece, high and low. I could, it just felt like it was it was broader in its implications, even though, as I say these things, I'm saying to myself, what?
Yeah. What prompted you to take the workshop?
I wasn't able, I stopped, I was writing music, and for some reason I couldn't, I was sort of stalled. So it was essentially out of play. I wasn't taking it with any grand design. And I was lucky enough to work with a creative writing teacher who brought really interesting, challenging work to us. She did not dumb the content of an introductory workshop down. I remember coming in. It was the first place I read Thomas Pynchon and Jane Bowles and John Hawkes. And I became a huge Jane Bowles fan in the course of that class and started writing what I think of now as Jane Bowles imitations. And I remember putting a story up in class and it going, it sort of, I remember it being received rather well. But that teacher followed me down the hall after class, and she said, "You know what you did?" And I remember thinking that her interest was sort of unfounded, and I was confused by it. I thought, oh, maybe she just wants to be seen as valuable and useful, as all teachers want to be seen. And but that gesture meant so much to me. Maybe not right on the spot, but years down the road, it was one of many affirmations that I got from others that helped me just turn my own lens in a different direction.
Right. Greg Hanlon, who was a journalist who was on the podcast of last year sometime, he was anthologized in Best American Sports Writing, and in that same year had a notable selection for Best American Sports Writing. So he just had an amazing run, and he referred to how important it was because it put gas in his tank. Right. He really dealt with, he articulated well that sort of the insecurity and the need for some affirmation to keep going.
Right.
And then so when he was able to get anthologized, it validated the work and and a lot of the struggle. And I wonder, when you talk about this teacher, giving you that affirmation, that must have, at that point, like you say, you didn't realize it quite at the time, but I imagine you reflected back on that, and in those down moments, that probably put gas in your tank and be like, right. Okay, I'm feeling down now, but she saw something in me then when I never saw anything at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And in memory, that just becomes an iconic moment.
Yeah.
An emblem of support. And I think you start to build those little emblems, and hopefully you have access to them in your memory during those long times of quiet when you're simply working and not getting much in the way of feedback or support. And those times, I think, are inevitable.
Yeah, of course. And how do you deal with those long times of quiet and sometimes that solitude and that need for reflection to sort of be alone with the work? But how do you deal with that when you approach those walls and hurdles of self-doubt and when you've been working with a piece for so long that it becomes so right. Boring and you hate it, but but you try to rationalize that you hate it because you've just spent hundreds of hours with it. So like, how do you overcome that and deal with that?
Yeah, there comes a point when you've worked so long on a piece, especially a long piece, that it becomes really hard to see it.
Yeah.
I usually work on something else at the same time. For me, I mean, I work on some really short pieces that I can finish rather quickly. So, yeah, I always like to have them going, so I at least get the satisfaction of some sense of completion. And it's usually the case that those kinds of pieces are, fairly, people ask me for work and I can send them that work. So there's like a more frequent kind of affirmation than, the kind of response you get from your editor when you've turned in a long narrative, a long manuscript. So, yeah, I think it's probably important. This seems like an impossible task, but for me, it's important to work on more than one thing at once.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In that sense, you're getting some freshness, but also a sense of completion along the way of some longer longer project. These little gold coins along the path that make you feel like you're accomplishing something.
Yeah, and I think if you're putting too much focus and too much light and energy on one thing, you can probably kill it. You can start to will it if it matters too much. I think if you disperse that energy, you probably come in saner relationship to what you're trying to make. And yeah, it's one way to preserve play, which is so important. It's so easy to forget the importance of play, or so easy to forget to nurture it when you're trying to do something serious.
So how do you foster and sort of coach along that sense of play when you're working? Like, what are some of those outlets, and how do you nurture that so you don't smother the important stuff with a pillow? Like you're able to nurture it.
Yeah. Well, I try to work in such a way that I don't these days have a set schedule. I like to write as frequently as possible, but it's not like the old days when I said, I'd sit at my desk at home at 9:00 and write, say for 3 hours, whether it was good or not. It seemed to be important at an earlier time in my writing to fix myself to that kind of schedule. And these days, I'll often write when I'm not even trying to, if that makes sense. I might be standing online, at a coffee place or somewhere at school, and I'll just peck something into my phone. And that's often a place where the origins of the best work, or there's a better way to put that. Some of the things that I'm most interested in start out that way.
Right.
It also involves giving myself permission to write in any circumstance. So that goes from writing in public to, last Wednesday, I actually wrote for 2 hours before I taught. And I think that's the first time in my entire writing life that I was able to write before I taught. And giving oneself permission to work at unlikely times, I think, is important.
So after you had taken that workshop, at what point in your life did you allow yourself to give yourself permission to pursue that as a vocation?
It probably took several years, and I think the permission was sort of fostered by getting certain awards and getting into certain colonies and getting into a certain grad school. And then there comes a point where you think, oh, I guess I'm supposed to be doing this. I'd like to think of myself as like a self-attuned person. like someone who is not dependent on outside approval and is, or outside validation in regard to my work. But I think early on, I didn't need all that. You kind of grow up over the years, and not. I think I love it. It's great to be published by X magazine or to win that award at a later point, but I think it meant more earlier on.
It goes to needing some degree of validation, that gas in the tank thing, to make sure that all these thoughts you have aren't completely delusional. Right.
And, writing is not the most, when I was young, my parents had, they wanted to make sure my brothers and I were taken care of and knew what we were doing. And, they were really practical people as much as they were people who were supportive of our interest in the arts. So, it's a different thing when these urges, these instincts and intuitions happen, when you're young and you're still at home and you haven't really cultivated an adult identity yet. You haven't been out in the world yet.
Yeah. So what did your parents do for work? And
my mom was a stay-at-home mom. But she was a musician and came from a family of musicians and actors. So, ironically, she was the one who was probably much more concerned about her sons having some sort of professional affiliation.
Yeah.
Really important for her, because she had seen how her brother, an actor, had struggled before he, went back to college. My dad was an engineer and was the first member of his siblings to go off to college. And, he was a very ambitious guy. Had lots of energy and self-belief, and
Do you think that's where a lot of, you said early on that a lot of when you were starting to write that you didn't necessarily need a whole lot of validation and affirmation early. Do you think, and you say your father had a lot of self-belief, do you think that's where your self-belief came from, that fearlessness that you were able to pursue whatever it is that you felt like you wanted to pursue at a given time?
Well, I think, there was a certain kind of reckless romanticism about my father. And I think I'm positive he thought we could do whatever we wanted to do just as long as we excelled in it, at it, and, invested all of our energy in a project. So, yeah, I guess so. Sure.
Yeah. That's one. Is that something about your personality that when you hook onto something, you tend to lean into it with all of your energy?
I think it's a part of my personality. I think there's also a part of my personality that is really distractible. And maybe I hook into something with all of my energy as a way to sort of resist that distractible impulse. It's like both of those things are there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't imagine sitting down in front of the laptop with, confidence and belief, at 100% level. I don't think anyone works that way. And it's probably the case that our doubts and uncertainties are necessary to getting back to it day after day.
Yeah. They kind of have to agitate the leaves at the bottom of the pond, turn it over.
Yeah, I like that metaphor.
So you've written a lot of fiction. So how did you come to want to write nonfiction with The Narrow Door?
Yeah, my second book, Famous Builder, is actually a collection of autobiographical essays, and I initially wrote that because I felt this urge, this desire to do something different from my first book, which was a novel. I didn't want to write the same trajectory and scenario situations. So I thought, what would it be like to be an amateur all over again? So that impulse, that desire fed that book. And then the next, The Burning House is a novel. Unbuilt Projects is this weird coalition of lyric essays and short like parables and fables and myths. So it's kind of like standing in two different territories. So when my friend Denise had died, and this was back in 2009, I had just finished Unbuilt Projects and didn't at all feel any urge to get going on a new book. But I did feel a sense of emergency around her loss. My mom had died 6 months before she died. So those two losses kind of coalesced for me, though I couldn't quite see it. Back then, I was, I was okay on the surface, and was teaching as a visiting professor somewhere, and paying my bills, and getting out of bed, and able to hold conversations with friends. But I think on a deep down seismic level, I was in trouble, and so that book just started out as a way to sort of sit with my friend a while and to think back on the iconic moments of our friendship and to get, I hoped, a clearer sense of who we were for each other and why this loss felt so huge. So, yeah, in part it was just about a desire to be with her over the history of our time together, but also to think about attachment and boundaries and where we begin and end, and what it means to manage or negotiate a goodbye with somebody. So I was sort of writing it first and foremost for myself. At a certain point, I figured out, this is probably a book, but I wasn't too caught up in that. It felt like the book was a kind of light when it didn't feel like there was that much light in my everydayness. So yeah, it was something I felt lucky to return to. It was my ongoingness when everything else kind of felt like a duty to me.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, even though I imagine that writing this book about Denise and your friendship with her was challenging emotionally because you guys were friends for close to 30 years.
No, it's crazy.
So yeah, and so was this a way too to also just spend a little more time with her and kind of just revisit a lot of the good and bad times that you had over the course of your friendship?
Yeah, definitely. Because we'd moved through, many different chambers in our friendship. There were times when we were really close. There were times early on when she was as much a mentor to me as she was a friend. And then there were times when we were a little bit more distant and we didn't talk to one another. And then there was a long falling out, maybe 20 years into the friendship, in which we didn't talk at all for 16 months. And we pretty much had it with one another. And there was something about the getting back together after that time of silence that I wanted to think about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it felt like that silence was a kind of test, and it was a relief to get in touch again after I think we'd sort of convinced ourselves that, you know, the friendship had run its course, and, you know, it was not easy to live with a sense of letting someone else down or being let down, yeah.
How do you think that 16-month window changed you and her? Like, what do you think changed in that window that allowed you to then graduate to a different chapter of your friendship?
Well, I actually didn't think about her all that much during months, and it was so. I don't think any quote unquote education happened until we were, you know, back together as friends again. And I think what had happened once we were back together was that the stuff of writerly competition didn't matter any longer. You know, we sort of like recalibrated. And I think what had happened was that, you know, stuff about power and status had unwittingly become too present. And we sort of developed another kind of friendship in the last years of our time together, where that stuff, you know, it wasn't completely off the table, but it was really, really far to the side.
At what point in your friendship, and I think it was pretty early on, if I'm recalling correctly in the book, because she had some fairly early prominent success as a novelist.
Right.
So, like, where did the writerly competition start to sort of breach the breach the surface, if you will, and it might not have even been spoken about. It might have just been some undercurrent.
Yeah. It was not spoken about. I mean, it was like communicated in, you know, gestures and silences. And I think things started to shift a bit once I started to get some fellowships and publications that Denise had actually wanted for herself. I think she had taught me to value, say, getting into that conference or getting into that school. And then I ended up applying to those institutions and ended up getting in. And I think that was uncomfortable for her. Comparing
oneself to other writers on their own trajectories is often the most toxic thing anybody can do. Yeah, it's almost impossible
to do it. Yeah, I mean, it's impossible. Not even when you'd like to think of yourself as enlightened or evolved. That stuff still happens. You know, someone gets on a list, or someone is a finalist for something. You know, a prize that you're not a finalist for. But if you let that that toxic feeling overwhelm you, then you're in trouble.
It's like you almost have to trick yourself into just get to this place where it's best to always be encouraging of one another. Mm-hmm. And even though like your most sort of raw emotions are going to want to trend towards maybe a little jealousy and competition, and like why didn't I get into this? Why didn't my stuff get picked for that? And then you start to devalue yourself. But eventually you just have to realize the subjective nature of the whole thing. And
right.
Then just find a love of the work itself and be grounded in the work. And if you can do that, the other stuff will take care of itself. And then if you encourage others and just try to be just a little bit of some degree of positivity in a community of artists and writers, I think you'll just be far more satisfied.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's best to save that competitive urge for oneself. I feel like I don't want to be boring. I don't want to repeat myself. And so I feel like my competition is sort of turned inward now.
Yeah.
I
How did you reach that
want to do
point?
something unexpected. I wish I could say. I mean, I think that could just happen over time because maybe you get at a certain point that the external rewards don't change your life. Maybe they do a little bit, but it's not where the real pleasure of this endeavor is.
Yeah.
I think the real pleasure is in challenging oneself to, to make something unique, to make something meaningful for other people, and to do that the best you can, and to look at your own tools, to look at your own weaknesses, and to turn them into strengths. And to make something that sounds like no one else, really.
Yeah. And when anyone takes on a project of memoir, I always, you kind of hit the nail on the head by saying making work that's meaningful to other people, and I think that's really has to be the ultimate goal of a memoir. Even though it's your story, you have to have a reader in mind. It has to mean more than what you're just saying, and you ultimately, if you've done it right, as I think you have for sure, people can then overlay their own. The reader sort of becomes you, and then their friend becomes Denise, or Denise becomes their friend. And I think,
or you're bringing the history of your own friendships to the page, and the ego of the writer has dissolved.
Yeah, and I think that's a testament to like a truly well done memoir. Is that they just overlay their own story on top of yours, and then it becomes theirs. And I wonder how present was that, having the story be meaningful to others. Like, how present was that for you as you were writing the book?
Oh, that's a good question. Maybe on an intuitive level, but I wasn't overtly concerned with that reader. I mean, consciously concerned with that reader. I mean, maybe I don't know how. I can't even conceive of writing a memoir without thinking of an audience. So it's just sort of assimilated in my thinking. If you asked me to write about me, if the lens was just on me, I would freeze up. So I always imagine using my autobiographical stuff as, a window into some kind of inquiry, into some kind of conversation. So, and in that way, it doesn't feel confessional. It doesn't feel like it's exactly about me. I'm just using, the sounds and images and memories of my own experience to, as a way into a conversation.
Yeah. I think even like thinking of an audience, probably in like the first draft or the first incarnations would probably be a bit strangling and stifling. But as you go through the rewrites, then you can have like a greater sense of respect for other people and be like, okay, that first draft is for me, but the next one, this is going to be the one that I'm gonna buff all the nastiness out of this, and this one's going to be for you guys.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that just happens.
Yeah.
In terms of fine tuning craft, if your descriptions are fine tuned and they feel invested with your own psychic energy, then that's going to be meaningful to a reader. It's not going to be meaningful to a reader if you're just using a kind of shorthand, emotional shorthand, or relying on cliches or generalizations. I mean, it's just going to be opaque, right?
Yeah. And in reading the book, I liked how you fragmented time throughout the whole thing. In a way, it created like this sort of like a Rubik's Cube with all the tiles that are all kind of like scattered all over, but it's still cohesive. And I wonder how you went about strategizing that structure, and also the way you chose to plot Denise throughout the book. So she is this. She's with us from cover to cover, even though you jump around in time a lot.
Yeah, and certainly step away from her and sort of think about her character through other lenses. I did not overtly strategize. With this book, I decided to pay attention to patterns, to sort of cultivate repetitions, to be aware of associations from section to section, and I wanted to see where that listening would take me. Earlier in 2010, when I was writing the book, Nick Flynn had released a book called The Ticking is the Bomb, and so much of that is about getting lost. It's a book that wants to wander. The speaker wants to learn something in wandering and in getting lost. So I sort of took direction from that book, and I wanted to see where I could go if I allowed myself to range in terms of thinking and subject. So the structure you have is pretty close to the initial structure I developed over the course of a year. Some material was added later on, but by and large, that's the route I took. And it was scary because I thought, my God, I don't want to make a mess, and I don't want this to seem chaotic and lax. So I think that fear really encouraged me to pay attention to patterns. So I thought, okay, if there isn't going to be a linear throughway through this, the reader has to sense some sense of glue holding this all together. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up writing a different kind of structure than I'd ever written before. My previous books are all fragmentary, although they might not look like it. My first novel, Lawn Boy, is essentially a collection of individual scenes. And I kind of wrote that book all over the place. I mean, not in any kind of chronological order. And when it came time, when I had enough material, I literally cut and paste that book together. It was printed out. I made this big art project on the floor. This is the first book that I wrote that I don't know how to say this well, but I wrote it consecutively. Yeah. So the scene with the volcano in the first chapter that's where I wrote it. It came right after that opening sequence around the dinner table. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the way it comes across too, it's how as you go through your day or through a month or a year, little memories pop up, and since that's kind of how I chose to how it felt to me is like, okay, well, here's this popped up, and you can't predict when a certain memory is going to crop up, and it just does. And that's how I sort of chose to interpret how she would just bubble up, or a certain vignette would bubble up.
And I think that's what grief feels like too. That's what memory feels like. It doesn't move so neatly, or it doesn't move, from A to B to C to D to E. It's much more wily than that.
So what surprised you most about the process of writing this book? Yeah, what cropped up, maybe what caught you off guard as you were writing this book?
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't expect my relationship with my ex to come to a crisis point in the writing of the book.
Mm-hmm.
There's a line, maybe 2/3 of the book, in which the speaker says to the ex, "I don't want this in my book," and that means, that's meant to mean in multiple directions. Like, I don't want this to ruin my book. This is the one thing, the one bit of light that I have right now, and obviously, it was devastating on other levels, but. Yeah, I thought the book was going to be entirely about Denise, and I didn't expect there to be a subordinate narrative about a breakup. So that was the big surprise. And the breakup was happening in the real time of the writing of the book.
Mm. Wow. So did the book end up being, in its own way, a little bit of a refuge from a lot of the external stuff you were dealing with at the time, too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a refuge, but it was also really painful also. Maybe it helped maybe hasten a kind of kinder detachment.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Like or a kind of distance in a way that made the unbearable a little more, I won't say bearable, but it felt like I could walk alongside it or stand with it. I felt like I could hold that darkness.
Yeah, it's like you could transform the real people, then like distance yourself and make them characters in a book, and thus creating that kind of distance, I guess.
Yeah, but it still doesn't, it doesn't absolve or resolve or cure or heal or make that pain any less difficult.
Yeah. And in your in all the readings that you've done, what has surprised you most about what readers have taken away from the story, or what questions do they come to you with most frequently?
People often ask about the structure. Mm-hmm. They ask about the design of the book even ahead of the content. So, it's interesting that compels them so much, or as many readers who have brought it up. So, that usually comes up again and again.
And how much attention in your process do you give to openings and closings of essays, of short stories, and even books?
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about openings as a teacher. There's something really thrilling about, what a good opening signals in terms of atmosphere and voice and and foreshadowing and all that stuff. I think they're incredibly important. And I'm just thinking about my own closings. I often write too far past where the natural closing is. Mm-hmm. So there was actually another long scene in The Narrow Door following the ending as written that would have taken the book in a different direction. And luckily I was able, the book was read by a friend of mine who knows my work over time and said, like, I don't think this doesn't work for me. And I could see that the book had already come to a kind of resting place before that. But I see that in a lot of my drafts, that I'm like, I try too hard to make an impression at the end, and inevitably I have to cut back. Mm-hmm. Or I've already arrived.
Yeah.
And didn't know it.
So
yeah, openings are hard.
Yeah. I know, John. I read something where, or heard an interview where John McPhee, when he'll sit in a chair sometimes just agonizing for 8 hours about just the lead alone of of a long magazine story or one of his 30 books, and because
Right.
he feels that the lead is the lighthouse. It's the light that cuts through and guides you right through the entire thing. So he labors over it.
Ideally, I mean, I love the idea of finding the right opening and that opening feeling like a cornerstone or a foundation, and giving you the stuff, to build this big tower.
Yeah.
But I think about my book, The Burning House, and I think that book, it took 5 or 6 years to find that opening. And there were so many different openings that were trying too hard. And finally, the opening that I used was not even initially written to be part of the book. It came from a little prose piece that was meant to stand on its own. And I looked at it one day and I thought, oh, there you are.
Mm-hmm.
You've always been around. The opening of The Narrow Door was always the opening. It was a matter of question.
Yeah, I think Mary Carr, when she was writing The Liars Club, she spent something like 9 months working on that first chapter. Because that was where she solidified her voice for the whole thing. But it took her a long time to get to that place where that chapter sounded exactly like she wanted it to sound, and then that carried her throughout the rest of the book. I'm sure, I don't know how long, but it could have been like the rest of the book took 9 months, but that first chapter also took 9 months.
Yeah.
Just to set this cornerstone.
Right. I think it's often been the case that I've written a way into the book as a book in progress, and kept the opening for last, just because I sort of hate the idea of dogging or willing something into being.
Yeah,
and most of the writing I've put aside over the years has been sort of dogged into being. Sort of, I push into the dirt with the top of my head, and you can feel the stench of the work in it. It's not good.
There's the pull quote: the stench of the work. So you've been a teacher for a while, and I always like talking to teachers who also write a lot as well, and how one feeds the other, or how one pirates from the other.
Right.
And I wonder how teaching has informed your writing, and maybe vice versa as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think I found a way to use my teaching life as a way to educate my work. So I use teaching as a way to stay awake, and I teach a lot of writers whom I don't know very well, who might be newer writers, so I can get to know that work, clearly, and to think about its architecture and voice, to think about how it might be different from what most of the people in the class are doing. We think about how it might differ from, certain iconic examples. I don't just teach new work. I mean, I like to teach, say, Flannery O'Connor up against a more recent writer. But yeah, it's important for me to go into the classroom not so much as an authority, even though I know more than my students do, just because I've been at it longer, but as a participant. So a lot of what I do is ask questions and invite conversations around the table. And we sit around that table and think together and have a collaborative, one hopes precise discussion about what we see in front of us. So, it's impossible not to take those conversations to your own work if, you're kind of thinking and you're on the spot.
What advice do students come to you often, or what questions do they, because most of them probably, they want to turn writing into some sort of vocation. Some, not all, but some certainly want to do what you're doing, which is writing books, short stories, essays. So I wonder what they might come to you and ask and for advice, or what is a common question you have heard over the years?
Well, I often get, what should I do? How should I use this time as an MFA student well? Mm-hmm. And one thing I tell them is to cultivate fandom. I mean, I think it's important to develop like a kind of literary fandom that's similar to the fandom that we have around musical figures, and that they should over the course of this time be captivated or find 2 or 3 writers who mean everything, and to read all of that work, to read it aloud, to type out sections in the page, to read all the writers' interviews, to read everything else that has been written about that figure. Because I think if you develop that kind of relationship, you develop a kind of permission for your own work. I can break this rule here because X broke that rule in this story. So yeah, I think those relationships are artistic rudders. So over and over and over again, I'm just trying to cultivate my students' reading habits.
So who might have been a writer or 2 or 3 that was like that for you, that you like hooked onto them and you read their whole canon to find the rules to break and the rules to follow?
Right. Oh, Flannery O'Connor from the get-go. Even before I started writing, I loved the mixture of kind of absurd comedy alongside, its grave questions about faith, etc. Primal questions that seemed really entrancing to me, and the tonal complexity of that work. I mean, I love the fact that A Good Man Is Hard to Find opens like some kind of dark sitcom and then just goes really dark and is sort of fearless in its trajectory. Joy Williams's work is also important to me, and I've loved that work since I was 23 years old. For some of what O'Connor does, I love Joy Williams's sense of atmosphere. Again, the absurdity, her interest and love for animals, and I love the way the stories want to sort of hold human darkness and human incomprehensibility. And I think that work is often seen as, nihilistic and I think it's up to something else.
So
something that's a little more complex.
Yeah. And I wonder what books do you turn to reread, like over and over again?
Well, they're often the books that I teach. I mean, I do go to Joy Williams over and over again. And, Flannery O'Connor, not as much. More recent books, like books by Nick Flynn, Maggie Nelson, Claudia Rankin. But I would love to visit Madame Bovary again. I'd love to visit Cheever. I'd love to visit Elizabeth Bishop. I was a huge Bishop fan about 15 years ago, and then I knew everything, and then I sort of moved on. But I'm supposed to give a reading next week of her poem, The Armadillo. And so I've come back to that work and found new things to appreciate and love in it. So there are just a few.
What are some of the books that you gift the most to friends, other writers, family members?
Yeah, I think it depends on the person because one doesn't ever want to force a book, especially a book that you love, on someone who might not appreciate it. It can be like forcing a religion on someone,
Yeah.
forcing AA on someone. It doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there can be something painful about recommending something that you're convinced that someone is going to love. I'm just thinking about last week. I was convinced that a friend of mine would love this musician, and I sat down with her and watched a video, and she put her hand up to her mouth and felt this psychic horror that I knew that it was. She found it really revolting and upsetting, and so much for my intuition about her, cultivating fandom once she got to know this musician. So, a book. But all that said, I've given Joy Williams to people, but she's tough because that work is pretty dark, and not everyone's in sync with it. I like her most recent book, 99 Stories of God. I think that's a good entry point. The stories are short, and you can kind of dip in and out of it. It doesn't have to be read consecutively. The stories have a real casual surface, even though they're up to complicated things. So that's one.
And how would you describe your, if you're in the throes of a writing project, or maybe even if you're not, like how would you describe your morning routine or that first 60 to 90 minutes of your day as you're priming the pump to get going?
Well, it's interesting. I usually get up fairly early. I like the idea of getting up earlier than anyone else nearby and just having that quiet time to myself. But I often don't start with writing. I sort of try to sneak into it, if that makes sense. So it doesn't feel like, a job. So there's a lot of putting off and delay and, going on Twitter, finding things to post on Twitter. Just puttering around the house and then sort of sidling up to it, from a sideways position. But, that can often happen hours into the day for me.
Right, so it's not very rigid.
It's not, I think I try to do everything possible to avoid rigidity. It worked for me at an earlier point, but as I said, I was living at home and I wanted to look serious to my parents. I didn't want to look like a goof, and I sort of taught myself to perform seriousness in that situation, but. It's sort of against rigidity, but there might be certainly, I don't want to seem like I'm so casual about this because there might be plenty of times when I'm working, for multiple hours a day. If I'm close to finishing something, I could, I might be working from noon to noon or morning till night. If I don't have other obligations,
Yeah.
Well, if I have other obligations, I might come back to it at night. So, they're just different levels of time and engagement. And I think for me, it's important to respect those different kinds of engagement.
Yeah, I was having a conversation a couple months ago with a former ballerina, and I'm always attracted to people who have almost a monastic devotion and a singular vision, and dancers and certain musicians and bodybuilders, all this. It's like, I love that. I kind of love the people who are obsessive, and she had since moved on from it. But I asked her, with so many talented people, how does one stand out? How do you make it? And she's like, oh, the one thing I noticed was it was people who knew who they were.
Interesting.
And so what you were just saying about your routine, like you used to have a more very rigid, structured schedule to stick to. Now it's a little more fluid. You have a different approach, and I think that just comes with knowing who you are at this point in your life. So
or at least trying to. Yeah, I don't, claim to know who I am. I hope.
But you know it's kind of working for you at this juncture.
I know it's working for me, and try to respect that.
Yeah,
make room for that.
I'm wondering,
someone else's rule might not work for you or you. Right?
Yeah, which I think is always kind of fun to hear how people go about the work, and maybe other people can kind of cherry pick one thing that Paul Lisicky has done, and then another thing that Glenn Stout's done. I think that's kind of it can help people. People like Seth Godin, who's just a genius marketer and everything he does, just a generous person and soul. He won't tell anyone his morning routine because he feels like it's a way of...
it's his magic.
It's not only that, but he feels like it's a way for other people to hide. He's like, what does it matter what I do? Go find your own thing. He's like, do your thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I can see that. I can see that rationale too. He's like, it's like Stephen King's pencil. He's like, just because you use the same pencil as him, he's the one doing the work. It doesn't matter what pencil he's using. It's not going to make you any better.
Right.
So that's his rationale for saying, like, I don't know how you can't have a morning routine, but I'm not going to tell you mine. Go find your own.
Go find your own. Yes.
Yeah. And I wonder also, what may be the best advice you may have received from your mother or your father or a trusted mentor, something that's really clung to you over the years?
I think it might come from my ex, who told me that one of my real gifts was in writing short pieces. And I don't think I'd been putting that much energy into that work because it seemed harder to sell collections of shorter pieces. And essentially he was telling me to put your energy into work that's uniquely yours, and forget about what's marketable or publishable in external terms, but allow yourself to grow there, and if you do that, good things will come from that.
It kind of goes back to what we were alluding to earlier about sort of knowing yourself as an artist. Like maybe that is the nature of your talent,
right?
Is trending more towards the shorter fiction or the shorter nonfiction.
Yeah, some people are marathon runners, and some people are meant to run sprints. And I think the books that sort of look like marathon books are actually compilations of sprints. So
yeah.
So I think it's more, and it's also about just like trying to make use of your own psychic materials and your own urgency, and how are you in trouble, and how can you make meaning of those struggles. So yeah, just about paying attention to what's inside us at any given moment, to stay awake to your own stuff, and how to bring that to your work, how to keep that cord, between the psyche and the project of your writing, how to keep that there at all times.
Yeah. Well, let's see. One more question for you. Where can people find you online?
I'm pretty easy to find online on the major, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And I also have a website that's pretty accessible. That's just myname.com and/or .net. So, yeah.
Okay. And on Twitter, would you be at Paul Lisicky?
Yeah, it's Paul_Lisicky.
Fantastic.
But, yeah, if you just Google my name with Twitter, the handle will come up.
Fantastic. Well, the book is The Narrow Door by Grey Wolf Press. A wonderful memoir. I encourage everyone to go out and buy it and buy one for their friends. and go out and see Paul if you see him at a reading, and ask him all sorts of questions. But in any case, Paul, thank you so much for carving some time out of your morning. I love the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll certainly keep in touch on the socials and email, and maybe when your next book comes out, we can have you back for a round 2.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
You got it. Take care.
You too.